Hey everyone, it's Amory. Welcome to the Amory's Book Club live chat with Tony Tulathimutte for Rejection, this fantastic collection of short stories. Thank you so much, Tony, for joining us. Before we go into any questions, if you don't mind, could you please give a short synopsis for people who may not have yet read the book?
Yeah, I really love when people ask me what the book is about because I have to just say rejection. No, it's a book of sort of connected short stories, mostly about people who take rejection really badly. There's stories about somebody who's rejected by a close friend and can't get over it. There's another about a guy who's rejected a lot over like 30 years. And then it sort of goes to some weird places later in the book, but that's basically what it's about.
So inspired you to write this collection? Did this all come at once, or because they're very interconnected? I don't imagine that they would have been written separately without having others in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I got the idea way back in 2011, and I just wanted to write a book about rejection for, I guess, what I think is a really obvious reason, which is that I've had a lot of it and was thinking about it a lot. It's sort of inescapable as a writer and as a person. Everybody goes through stuff like that. But, I sort of was surprised at how few books there were out there, like literary fiction books that were specifically about this subject. You see rejection sometimes as sort of like a side plot or a plot point. But a whole book just about that topic was something that I just sort of found lacking, and I realized I had to do myself at some point.
There is one particular character that we meet in the first story, the feminist, who in many ways feels like an every guy, in some ways I would say even an every person, but specifically I feel like we're dealing with someone that we've heard a lot about in the news, probably the last 10 years or so. Um, I don't want to say nice guy gone bad because there's so many other things going on there, but can you give us your inspiration for creating that particular character? However much.
Yes, that was actually the first story that I came up with. And, way back when I was working on it, I had very little idea of what it was going to be about besides just like a guy who gets rejected a lot. And, for years, I was just writing these little scenes where, he tries and fails, strikes out with, all these different women. And it wasn't really going anywhere. It didn't really have a sort of angle or a point of view, and I put it aside for a while. And then, a few years later, around like 2017, 2018, it sort of struck me. I mean, when there was a lot of discourse around this kind of a guy who, you could just sort of describe as a try-hard male feminist. It's like somebody who sort of is extremely aggressive and off-putting in the way that he tries to demonstrate his feminism. Was sort of more in the news. And I realized that's the sort of perfect starting point for that character. Now, usually you're trying to avoid writing, stereotypes types or caricatures, when you're writing literary fiction. But um, to me, as a starting point, I was able to use people's expectations around what that kind of person is like, and then sort of deviate from it halfway through. So, without spoiling too much, uh, the sort of bitterness over 30 years turns him into another kind of archetype, which is that of the sort of like embittered woman-hating mass shooter, right, toward the end of it. So, uh,
No
you know,
spoilers.
yeah. I mean, it's a pretty well-known story now by this point. So if people have heard of it at all, they've probably heard that part of it already. But I think that the fun for me was to figure out how to take these two very different archetypes and have one lead to the other.
Hmm.
Uh, and in the process of doing so, I sort of realized like I was thinking of them at the very beginning as kind of like opposites, right? It's somebody who talks all the time about how much he loves women versus, somebody who ends up sort of reviling them. And, one kind of interesting thing I realized in the process of it is that they're really not opposites, right? That they have the kind of same relationship and single-minded devotion to an ideology, and it doesn't take all that much of a change to transition from one to the other. It's mainly a matter of circumstance.
It's so interesting that you say that because I think about that a lot when it comes to whether it's like political beliefs, social beliefs, just stances on anything in life. Anything that takes, like, when they say that within anything is the kernel of its opposite, or it's like a seed of its opposite, right? So like love and hate, and vice versa. And then what he begins as and what he ends up being, people can think of it as being like the spectrum, but really it's almost like this circle. You can go here and it can just shift into something else.
Yeah.
But that is hard to determine. There's no like fixed point that can determine.
Yeah. And when it comes to things like sort of like really intense zealotry, like when you become sort of single-mindedly fixated on something, very often that intensity is coming from the fact that you sort of fear or dread the opposite thing existing inside yourself, and you want to kind of crush it out in the world. I think that Freud called that reaction formation.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon, and it gives you a lot of sort of room to play with kind of character development over the course of the story.
That actually is not Freudian exactly, but I was watching something regarding character development, and they were talking about Batman,
Yeah.
Batman, and I think the Joker, and why the part of the Joker exists. It's like the shadow side of Batman, the thing that he
Yeah.
fears. It's like incarnate. So not Freudian, but yeah, that whole idea that something else can exist.
Actually, yeah, I never thought about that, but actually, like, you could say that the feminist is sort of the arc of that story is he goes from Batman to the Joker.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, but it's like, it's like the thing that's within all the time, right? It's like the flip side, within something is something else.
Yeah.
And it depends on what else is. Yeah, I really felt for him, but one of the things that I really liked about his arc is that I feel like it really illustrated how just in life, like in a very real way, how real life works, which is that there are rarely delineations of good, 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 and now it's bad. It's like there's these shades of gray where you're constantly negotiating feelings, the terrain, the social landscape, but there is like it's never fixed. You know what I mean? Like what is good, what is bad, what is good for society, what is bad for society.
Yeah. And, uh, I think it's interesting because I'm not very good at plot, I think. But there's something that's sort of similar to that, which is when you show the kind of like pivotal moments in somebody's life that ends up affecting them, and instead of watching a plot develop, you're watching a character develop, and it sort of feels like the same kind of progress. So, this is actually what we do with our own lives, I feel. Like when you think about, your life from childhood to now, a lot of things have nothing to do with each other. It's not like there's a neat progression from one thing leading to the next, even though when we tell the stories of our lives, we sort of force it into that kind of template. But
Mhm.
the thing that does sort of steadily change and follow from one to the other is the kind of person that we are, right? It's very rarely the case that you wake up one day and you're completely different than the person you were yesterday, but you are at the same time also always changing, right?
Right. Right. And actually, when you're saying you're not really good at plot, no, it didn't feel plotty in the sense that it's like action, 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 but in the sense that there is a progression in the story, there is something happening. You definitely feel movement that was really there because it's just, so character focused.
Mhm.
Um, but at the same time, there's just so much happening. I'm trying to figure out how to not spoil this. This is meta, but then it's like meta.
Mm.
You
Go ahead and spoil it. I really think that
know?
I tried to write a book that would be good whether or not you knew what was in it or not.
Well, it's like we're getting the story and we don't really know who to believe. So it's almost like you have this story presented, the collection is presented in one way, you're moving throughout it. You almost feel as if you have a neutral narration, right? A neutral narrator, and only to come to find out, wait a minute, this is coming from a very distinct perspective the entire time. I think the very last thing I annotated it. Wait, this is before that. Actually, where's the part towards the end where I think I just wrote, oh, page 246. So it's the whole thing where it's like the little anecdotes, the little tiny little, I don't think they're interstitials exactly.
Yeah.
But at the very end, I wrote, Tony is a genius. Can you talk about that particular section of the story, which kind of I feel like we pulled back for a second, but it just ties everything in. It's just the structure of the story, I feel like I'm not doing it justice. The way that you structured the story, and then you threw in these 16 metaphors again, pulling out again. Like the
Yeah.
lens is always going in and out, in and out.
Yeah. I'm
What
really, really glad you brought that story up. I mean,
do you mean?
virtually none of the criticism so far has mentioned that story. And I think that it's an odd duck. It's a very different than all the other ones, and it's very short. So it's kind of easy to sort of overlook in the scheme of things, but it's there specifically, just like you said, as a way of tying the book together on a thematic level. So the story's called 16 Metaphors. It's sort of 16 metaphors about rejection, but they're very strange, right? I mean, from the very first one, I think is like, you catch a fish and then it throws you back.
Mhm.
It's taking this sort of familiar cliche and kind of inverting it in a strange way. And from there, it just kind of gets weirder. I was really, it's got like four different purposes for being in the book. One is that, uh, the way that the book progresses, I didn't want to keep on writing the same story, over and over again. And so every story was supposed to be kind of an answer to, or in some way, as reciprocal of the story before it, right? So if the first story is about a guy getting rejected over 30 years by a lot of people, the second story is going to be about a woman being rejected by one person over about 1 year. And
Mhm.
then, from then on, I'm like, well, these are both about, straight people. I'm going to have a sort of like gay character and have that perspective in there. And, other things were sort of flipped around as well. And then after that, like, I started running out of ways on a sort of content level to sort of make the next story the opposite of the one before it without
Mhm.
kind of reaching for shifts in form, right? So instead of straight narration, like you point out, the narrator starts to change. It becomes a first person narration, in the form of like a Reddit post.
Mhm.
And then, after that, it gets even sort of stranger, and you're not even really sure who is narrating the story or who the story belongs to. And yeah, that question, there's a lot of candidates that are floated in the book. Like, is the narrator or the person speaking this entire book, is it Tony? Is it the narrator? Is it this character B in the story? Does it belong to this universe of other stuff that I've written, and so on and so forth? And I wanted that to be something that people really teased out. So in a really, in a roundabout way, answering your question, when you get to 16 metaphors, there is a really big kind of like clue or secret about that big question that I wanted to sort of encrypt into the story. And that's not something I'm going to spoil.
Okay.
That's something I really hope that people will sort of, read closely and be able to suss out. But that is one of the reasons why it's in there. The other is that, when you're rejected and you want to talk about it to other people, what you get from them mostly is like a ton of cliches, right? Like they give you these platitudes to make you feel better because of their friends and they just don't want you to suffer. And so they say like, you're just such a great person, or, it's their loss, or you would have been bad for you anyway. And you get tired of hearing stuff like that. You want people to actually just kind of sit with you in your, pain, right? And so, that story was also another way of taking and inverting the cliches around rejection in a way I thought was interesting.
Even just exploring the idea of rejection, I feel is very of the moment regarding just something to do. There were previous generations. It's kind of like, hey, you just buck up. You just go, move through with it. You don't dwell on the thing. And I think there's a lot of like self-reflection,
Mhm.
um, as therapy. Just it's just having that awareness that I feel like this a collection like this could only really it's so of the moment and captures our time.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny to hear you say that because I was working on it for so long, right? I think if I published it earlier, maybe I would have been ahead of the curve, but now I'm just right on the money.
I,
So
I feel like it's like when I talk about that timing, I'm really talking about anywhere from, well, yeah, I guess like 2015 to now, like the last 10 years, right?
yeah, yeah.
Where
I mean,
when
it's a good
working
insight
on
because, like, I think that something that people pick up on a lot about the book is that it feels very millennial.
Yeah.
And, I'm 41 years old, so I'm at the, extreme upper limit of what is called a millennial. But I think that, this neuroticism and specific kind of isolation and loneliness is this kind of millennial affliction. And it's the result of like all kinds of things. But one of the things is the sort of shift, from not having an internet to having one right around your formative years. For me, it was like age 12, I think, right? You live in this analog world with like, phone booths and like, smoking in restaurants and stuff. And then
Mhm.
all of a sudden you have this, portal that shows you the entire rest of the world, and reveals you to the entire rest of the world as well. And, thank God I didn't have like social media, in high school. I can only imagine what that is like. But I think that getting social media then in my like early 20s, when you're the most kind of, you know, concerned and neurotic about how you're coming across to other people, I think, is, it's we didn't develop an immune system for that stuff. There was no sort of codified way of behaving or acting. And so looking back on it, people behaving in really cringeworthy ways. So I don't think that Gen Z has the same problem. I mean, because when you're born with it, you sort of receive this kind of de facto media training, from birth, right? They're used to it. Whereas having to transition to it, I think has made a lot of us constantly worried and on edge about like, you know, is this coming off right? Do I look the way that I want to look? What do other people think about me, and so on? And that's of course something that comes up centrally in, when somebody is rejected.
So for those who have grown up with it, in what ways do you think, 'cause, it's kind of like, yeah, that's like their ecosystem. It's just something that they know. They don't know what, like we don't know a life without electricity, really. You know what I mean? With
Yeah.
just flipping a switch and it turns on. We don't know what that is not. What do you think they're missing? Are they missing anything, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's just a different sort of environment to grow up in the same way that like, growing up during the sexual revolution would have been different, or growing up with the introduction of radio or TV. It's just a new playing field, really.
What about, for instance, attention span, the ability, the desired, like our habits regarding watching, the way we, take in media, kind of forms of media, books rather than
Yeah,
TV shows rather than long form films.
yeah.
Do you feel like there, I guess, you don't know what you're missing if you don't even know that it was there, I guess.
Yeah.
But at the same time, these things do change our habits as a society, which, when people are looking for short, it was like short YouTube videos and it went to shorts and then to TikToks. It's almost like bite size, bite size, bite size, bite size. What does that do to our habits? What does that do? How does that then translate to how we live our life in the analog world, if at all?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm of several minds about this. I think that like, on the one hand, when we say people's attention spans are dwindling, we're usually a little selective about what we mean about that, because I know that, it's still the case that people will spend, an entire weekend just binge watching a TV show, or, I personally can just like sit down and get lost in a video game for, 8 hours on end if I'm not careful. And so, we don't usually talk about the attention span for that kind of thing. It's partly because those things are designed to be addictive. It doesn't take a lot of effort to become invested in them. But it is the evidence that we are able to pay attention to something for like a long period of time. On the other hand, I wouldn't disagree that like, yeah, the attention span, the ability to commit attention in a sustained way to things like books, or even movies, and a lot of people just are on their phone when they watch movies at home or even at the theater, has changed. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is a, sort of like, it's sort of tricky territory to be in, because like on the one hand, you don't want to have this kind of moral panic thing where like, even when novels were being introduced and, sort of mass propagated, there was this question like, are novels ruining, people's brains or the youth? Is it trash or not, right? And that's been the case with every single new mass medium since then. That's, I don't want to go too far on it. It is something that we just do to new media. On the other hand, like, yeah, books have competition now. And I think that, rather than just kind of like sort of wring your hands about it, it is kind of incumbent on writers to write in such a way that it's going to be, good competition for the other stuff. I'm not saying like we need to do what TikToks do or video games do. I'm saying that like for what literature is able to provide uniquely that is like nowhere else, you can't be just copycatting them. You're always going to lose, right, to the image. So you have to do something else, and that is something that is sort of equally, compelling or gripping, right? This is something that David Foster Wallace wrote a lot about when, he was talking about television, and I think, the same pretty much holds true. Just that the way of going about it is not just to emulate, what your competition is, right?
Have you read Infinite Jest?
Yes, I have.
I knew you did. I was like, I know he did. I have not. It's been sitting on my shelf for 15 years.
Yeah, but surprisingly, I mean, it is written to be a really quick read. It's very funny and enjoyable. It takes about as long as reading 3 or 4 books. The only recommendation I would have is to do what I've seen other people do and rip the book in half, where all of the footnotes start, and have them
Oh,
separately as 2 books so that you're not constantly flipping back and forth between them.
I did hear people talking about that. I've been meaning to read that book for the longest time. It's just there like a chunk, like a weight.
Yeah.
But I'm going to move it on up the TBR. I'm going to move it on the TBR. But see, I feel like I hear you. I agree with everything that you said, all your various thoughts on that. But it makes me wonder too, additionally, okay, but it does change our habits. The grab them. And in a way, I feel like I sense that with novel writing too, where you would see a lot of the surge in genre, the surge in YA, and then some people I think in adult literary might have the impulse or the temptation, I should say, to hook the reader, grab the reader. A more, do you know what I mean? Like that, but that's not a bad thing. Although it's like there's something to be said about maybe a novel that just meanders.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll
Yeah.
have a smaller audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, books can do all kinds of things, right? That there's nothing inherently better about a book that is like, uh, really spectacular and gripping from page one versus one that sort of makes you work a little bit more, or is even boring the entire way through, but then when you think back on it is really rewarding, and enriching, or even, it's just stuff that makes other books more interesting because they're influenced by them, right?
Mhm.
So, you can do anything in a book really, but I just do think that like, it's sort of you're really not going to be able to write the same kind of book that people were writing, 50 or 100 years ago before they were influenced by stuff like this. You have to kind of meet the moment when you're writing, and yeah, hopefully without capitulating the values of literature as opposed to, film or TikToks or whatever.
I love what you just said. I'm gonna remember that. Cause I feel like you have to meet the moment. That's just like clicking for me because I think that that goes with any artistic endeavor. Like whether we're talking about writing, you're talking about music, um, or just like visual arts, right? Meeting the moment. That's selfishly, I'm putting that in my back pocket. My toolbox. I'm gonna put that in my toolbox. We're speaking a lot about like this time and the internet and the influences and how that's changed things. I do want to talk about what 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 your thoughts are regarding how the internet has changed or influenced our sense of community as human beings generally. And I'm not even talking about like just in one country, but just generally how it's behaved, how it's influenced our behavior, how it's influenced the way we see ourselves in relation to others.
Mhm. Yeah, so those are all really big questions, right? One, just to start with the idea of community in general, we've already seen plenty of examples of how the internet can provide kind of a lifeline to specific kinds of community. If you live in a small town with, for example, like not a big LGBTQ population, and your, community is going to be formed by other people that you connect with online, that can be really important and useful, right? It can give you a sense that you're not existing in total isolation. And, more broadly, just like if you just live in a place where there's nobody or nothing that you like, then an internet community is certainly going to be better than nothing, right? The problem comes sort of when people take the kind of frictionlessness and the endless sort of variation of the internet and they use it as a substitute for everything else, right? To the point where they don't even really try to make bonds outside of it. And this is something that is, really becoming pretty increasingly common. I think that everybody does have a sense that things are getting lonelier and more isolated. I don't think that it's this magic spell that the internet is casting on everybody that's, making them hate and fear people in real life. It's just more that it's sort of like easier and designed to be kind of addictive that way. And there's always the possibility that like some kind of real world opportunity might come to you through it. You might have an accidental like, viral tweet, or you might like say Haktua and then all of a sudden have a podcast, right? And so there is this kind of, casino like, slot machine aspect to interacting that way. But more to the point, like uh, I think that there's nothing wrong with like socializing on the internet as long as it doesn't begin and end there, right? I think that plenty of people meet on the internet and they meet up in real life and then they like get married, right? I think that like about half of all married couples these days meet on dating apps. That's a form of the internet.
Wow.
Yeah, I think so.
Wow. Well,
Uh,
I just did a couple yesterday, actually. They met on Match.com.
Yeah, I didn't even know that was still around, but there you go. And no one's going to say that's like an illegitimate way to meet someone or to form a connection to somebody else, I think. But yeah, when it's just like, what in the second story in Rejection, there's this, it's called Pix, and there's a group chat, right, where of people who are like all used to do the same media internship together, and they're constantly sort of commiserating with each other and joking around. And that can be really fun, but you see by the end of the story that it gets destroyed, and very easily on impulse, right? That is something that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do with your coworkers, for example, or your family, or people that you have to deal with in ways that are sort of more durable. So I'm not a pro or con internet community guy. I just think that we need to know, what the, benefits and drawbacks of each of those kinds of socialization are.
I wonder if, because I didn't think about that in terms of like, people taking those online relationships in real life and actually turning them into genuine relationships. But then I also can see the appeal in maintaining a kind of contained relationship center. It's like a hub of your relationships. And in a way, it's easy because they're kind of flattened, they're simplified, and they're kind of put into a corner versus like becoming an actual part of your life. It's more like an extension. I can see the appeal in that, but also I can see how it can appeal to people who are more introverted, but also for people who might maybe be on the line. Maybe they were probably introverted, but with a little nudging, they would have been able to go out there. It's just that the bar of entry is so much lower. It's just easier.
Yeah. The other thing, nice thing about the internet is that like you're not as tied down to identity or reputation as you are in real life necessarily, right? You can just always make a fake account, say you're somebody else who you're not, and people will believe you because they have no reason to otherwise, right? And
But you cover a
identity.
lot in this collection.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. And identity is something that can be, really rewarding and the basis of a lot of like self-understanding and connection with others. And it can be equally estranging and oppressing, when you're feel tied to or committed to something that you don't feel adequately represents you, right? So that sort of plasticity of the virtual world is appealing for that reason. But again, it can become this thing that sort of eats up or takes over the rest of your life. So, as you say, I think that it is sort of best considered as an extension rather than as the sort of central source of socialization.
What are your thoughts regarding like the veils, the layers upon layers, the veils upon veils? Because like you said, you can be online and you can really be anyone who you want to be, but then it's almost like everyone is their own brand. Even if they are just like an average person, they're not selling anything. It's
Yeah.
almost like they've become the brand and
Hmm.
they view themselves as branding themselves, even if they have nothing, yeah, have nothing to sell. They're just living life, but their online presentation is branded.
Yeah, I think, uh, veil is a great word for it because I think that it's always been the case that, there are different conceptions of selfhood, starting from, the person that you believe you are on the inside, extending outwards to the person you are with your friends and family and other people you're intimate with, uh, outward further to your professional presentation, and what the internet has done is sort of introduced extremes in this sort of series of veilings of the self, where all of a sudden there's a conception of like the person that you are to literally every other person on earth, right? Which is like your online identity, something that's a sort of universally accessible. Um, I won't say universally because not everybody has the internet, but and to anybody who does have the internet. And then, but these are things that writers have definitely always grappled with, these sort of disjuncts between, who you think you are, who you say you are, how you come across to others without knowing it, and even, on the deepest level, like who you really are, even unbeknownst to yourself, right?
Mm.
So yeah, I think that the internet has just created this sort of amplification of this existing, series of layers that people use to conceive of themselves. And it has also introduced the possibility of a lot more fraud where that's concerned, right? Of, pretending to be somebody in order to, reap the rewards of it or to be gratified in a way because you want to be seen in a certain way. So yeah, it is a really interesting subject.
It is really interesting too, because in a way, it's almost like a feedback loop. Because a
Yeah.
lot of times, brands are used to thinking, what is our brand? You go to a marketing meeting and they're like, this is the advertisement. And then everyone's trying to talk about, well, what is this ad saying? What is this talking about our product? Now that you have people branding themselves and they have, like, say, for instance, an Instagram page or a Facebook page, they essentially get a bird's eye view of their own life in a way that they wouldn't have, say, 15, 20 years ago,
Yeah.
where they
And
might say, who am I? I don't know. I like this. I like that. But now they can be like, who am I? I'm the person who likes to do this. And I go hiking and I do that. And I drink out of this water bottle. And they
yeah,
view themselves that way.
right. And for anybody with any kind of a following, and I think lots of people have more than a couple hundred followers now, um, you know, uh, the majority of people who know about you at all will know about you from the outside in. They'll know about you from your public persona before they knew you as a person. Now, like when we talk about like authenticity, usually we're talking about something like, well, the person you are on the inside is being expressed outwardly, right? Like, so I wear the kind of clothes I wear because, that's the kind of person I am. I make the kind of jokes that I make, and when I write a book, whatever, it reflects my true feelings and things like that. But what we get right now is because there are so many potential rewards to having people like your image and sort of become invested in it, we're getting a lot of pressure to go the opposite way and to sort of define yourself for starters, from what kind of effect you're going to have on others. And then that ends up sort of seeping inwards, where you're like,
Right.
well, I better, I don't, really like this person, but they might be good for my career. So I'm going to just like be really friendly to them when I hang out with them. And then I'm going to even convince myself that they're a good person, and so on and so forth, right? And
Mhm.
again, it is because, there are these sort of at least uh, potential rewards in doing so, that and it's becoming so much more tied to people's careers and reputations, that it's just temptation everybody has to grapple with.
I wonder if that can kind of get us into, because you were talking about the nihilism of the early aughts, right? And then
Yeah,
I feel like we kind of came out of that, but then in a way, it's almost can like circle back to that, because once people begin to realize that and think,
yeah.
I don't really even know who I am or what I like because I'm posting this because it performs well.
Mhm.
They stop looking at their things as art, or their life as just like a life that they're living, but more like a branded, like they look at it as content or a product. And I wonder if at the end of that, the realization one would have is like, what does this all mean? Which basically goes back to what we had before
Mhm.
all of this. Not the
Yeah.
entire time, but that nihilism era you were talking about. I remember, do you remember that website? I didn't go on it all the time. I think I might have like peeked at it. Faces of Death.
Oh yeah. I mean, I remember the video series when that was out. But yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Very gruesome stuff.
Yeah.
And you were talking about microdosing trauma.
Yeah.
What was the result of that? That like weird, it's almost like we had the internet. It's like the internet can show you chat rooms across the world. You can chat to this person in Bulgaria somewhere. Ooh, it's like "Jijong, jijong, ding," and they're loading. And then it just be you people were using it for different things. And then it gets to the point where it's like we're gonna use the internet to like look at faces of death and those kinds of things. What came after that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge question, and a really fun one to think about. So, the internet was born out of this like sort of utopian idealism where it's just like we'll all be connected, we'll be able to share things with people in other countries and meet people that we never know, and have all this information available to us. And there's just so many unexpected consequences of this sort of free flow of information. And one of them was the existence of these kind of like shock sites on the internet, like rotten.com or Consumption Junction or whatever in the early aughts. And for a lot of people in my generation, it was this real eye-opening thing where it's just like there's evil out there in the world, or there's disgusting depravity out there in the world that I never could have conceived of, right? And the first thing when people hear about things like this is like, why would you ever want to look at that? What is the appeal of something like that? And part of it is, just the kind of horror movie impulse to, as I say in the book, kind of like microdose trauma in a way that might even be cathartic. And to satisfy your sort of curiosity, to give a sort of tangible image to the dread that lives in your head. But it also kind of skews and distorts your idea of what is out there, right? If you're drawn to stuff like that, then all of a sudden you might think that the world is much more violent and hostile than it is everywhere, right? Um, so, thinking about how this progressed, I mean, there used to be this big kind of discourse around irony and insincerity, like especially around 9/11, right? Where it's just like people were saying irony is dead, that was definitely not right. But the idea was like, what's the best way to present yourself? And this becomes, this plugs right into that question of like, should I try to be authentic online, or should I, do behave in a way that's like the most sort of materially rewarding to me. Uh, the immune system I was talking about before, part of that has sort of kicked in, and people are becoming skeptical about people, acting like shells or bots of people online in a way that's very predictable, as optimized for engagement and for attention. And people can recognize those things now. I don't think that there is an end to this, though. I mean, I don't think it's like this linear progress where we're eventually going to get over it and it's all fixed. I think it's more of like a cycle, right? Where, uh, at a certain point, people would be like, okay, let's get rid of that sort of fake, inauthentic performing and be our real selves. And then people are like, well, what is it like to behave like your real self? And then eventually that gets codified and commercialized, and a new sort of idea of authenticity emerges, and then that gets rejected, at some point in the future, and it just keeps going on and on forever.
Yeah, it's almost like we're always looking to find the answers, but then it's like there really is no answer. We're like constantly moving. Everything's old. The goalposts are moving. The pendulum is always swinging, and we always have to just find our footing in the moment.
Yeah, I think that like there really is no way of having self-awareness and
Mhm.
having the thought, what do I look like, or what do I seem like to other people? And then not find yourself at least with one foot in this sort of question of like, is what I'm doing and is what I'm thinking right now authentic or not, right? And then once you're neurotic about that, then it's like, you don't know actually. You can't tell yourself because you can be deluded. Other people can't tell you because they're not you and they're not in your head. And so you just kind of, if you're a neurotic person like me, just sort of wring your hands over it endlessly, or write a book.
Which it was a wonderful book. Um, One of the stories in there is called Our Dope Future. And there's a character, he has this idea that I guess is like really insane. At the same time, I wrote in the margins like, actually, what did I write exactly? I said intriguing and, dare I say, appealing. Okay, so he's kind of, it's like we could get together, create this little cult, and then we'll just basically uh, they'll just keep propagating the cult and create their own group to city or community to city, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I was like, there's an egoic side that's like, yes, a whole bunch of like yous,
Right. Yeah, I
descendants,
mean, I think
like
that
Genghis
is,
Khan style.
yeah, I mean that guy, is sort of a parody of a optimization tech bro, right? Like a guy who's really well adapted to, uh, modern capitalism and its prerogatives, which is like, always be grinding, always be improving yourself, always, just be making more money. And this fantasy that he has at the end, which he reveals to his kind of like beleaguered girlfriend, who he's basically been abusing, is like, this fantasy of like, I'm just going to have a family that's so massive that it ends up encompassing most of the globe's population, right? I'm going to have 12 kids, and those kids will have 12 kids, and those kids will have 12 kids. And I'm going to get my blood replaced every day. So I'm going to live to the age of 180. And so I'll be the head of all of them. And to me, it's like this kind of monstrous extreme of, what we would call the American dream, right? The sort of dream of suburbia, which is, you have your own little house where you're the ruler, you get to control everything. Your family, are your the closest, friends, and they all like you and look up to you. And it is like a power trip, right? He extends this to, the level of a nation state, basically. And so it is, if it is at all appealing to anybody, it's appealing as this sort of fantasy of like, what if I had infinite power, infinite sort of control? Everybody believed the same thing that I did. There would be world peace, everyone would like me, and, that is, I think, what people, in a really modest way, in a much more humble way, are kind of reaching for when they're trying to do all this kind of identity control or personal branding, where it's just like, I want to people to sort of, be influenced by me, right? But I take a sort of Swiftian approach, and I bring it to such like a crazy extreme that like this is something that would, literally, turn it into this massive eugenic project, basically.
Right. That's brings me to the question, like, what's the difference between a brilliant or an insane idea?
Uh, I don't know, honestly. I mean, I think that like, when we say that an idea is insane, we either think that it's unrealistically to achieve, or that it's, perverse, right? That's just like, it seems brilliant in concept, but it would actually harm you or harm other people, and it's not worth it. So, I think when we call an idea brilliant, we can usually see or have some idea of what its immediate sort of salutary effects are. And sometimes an idea is so brilliant that, people, it's not easy to see exactly what those positive outcomes of it would be, and it gets called insane, right? But sometimes ideas are also just insane. So hard to say.
I think a lot about human beings and how we are the same as we've always been, how we're different in some ways. There's been such great change, exponential change technologically.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we are still hardwired the same. There's no way, from an evolutionary perspective, that we can really say that we've caught up with technological advancements. And just like the way our society even works now, it's almost as if we're in it, we are adaptable. And so we're still managing to keep up. But in so many ways, things work in opposition to our nature, I think. Whether it's like, for instance, we have desire to commune, to be together, social creatures. Then you have the internet, which definitely, I think, allows us to connect with other people, but also isolates us as well. Kind of like how the telephone like before the internet, the telephone allowed us to have like a buffer zone. Like before, you might have to go see someone, pay them a visit if you wanted to have a conversation. You have to sit down, knock on the door, think about how long you want to stay, don't want to stay long. Then you could just call them. Then you had I don't think it came in the beginning. No, it certainly didn't. The advent of voice message. And it was like a voice message machine where you actually don't have to talk to the person. You can leave them a message, and then people would start to hope that the voicemail message would come on so they could avoid actually having even that amount of contact. Then you come texting, or people don't even want to leave a voicemail. Who leaves a voicemail message anymore? We can just send a text. You don't even actually have to say anything at all, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like in some ways, the convenience has allowed us to really relax into a more distant way of interaction.
Yeah, I mean, you can pull that thread even further and say, like, yeah, now some people don't even really text the people in their lives. It's going to be a group chat, or it's going to be a post on social media that they expect you to see. And then, you don't even have to be actively engaged in that media for it to exert a kind of influence on you. Like, when the phone, was a thing, and then people, wanted to go out and had nowhere to go, they would just sit by the phone waiting for someone to call, right? Or, you might
Sitting by
have,
the phone.
yeah, right, yeah. Or in these days, you might, like, have a crush on somebody and just like be like, staring at their Instagram page, waiting for them to put a new story up, so that you might be able to respond to and say, what's up. But yeah, so it even when you were not actively using it, it still has that pull on you. As for what this does to us or how we respond to it, I mean, I think that we're just not responding to it, right? I mean, like, there's always going to be, young people who are on top of this stuff and ahead of the curve. And the older that you get, the less capable you are because of your other commitments to really keep up with stuff. And, that this sort of rift or chasm, emerges between generations that way. So there, for a lot of people, you just like don't keep up. You don't adapt. Mostly communicate with other people who are on that same tier of development as you are. But you know, I don't know if that is uh, even necessary, right? That, for my parents, talking to people on the phone suits them just fine. It's something that strikes fear and terror into my heart now to like have a 10-minute long phone call with somebody. But I don't think that they feel like anything is lacking where that's concerned. So, I think that the pressure to keep up is, largely a sort of, extension of the fear of aging or the fear of obsolescence. But it's, doesn't necessarily mean even if you become obsolescent that you'll, be alone.
Mhm, mhm. And it's funny because it's like with all that technology, it's kind of like the same question, the same age-old question for human beings. It's like, I guess, like the fear of being alone.
Hmm. Yeah. And, it's particularly scary like the fear of death or whatever because it is so likely, right? I mean, there's like
Great,
people,
Tony,
yeah,
great.
I mean, you can sort of develop a phobia of anything, but
Yeah.
things like being alone is just like, a small shift in your circumstances or whatever, and you could find yourself socially outcast. You could, have your partner walk out on you. You could break up with your best friend. Those things are all possible, just depending on what happens, and anything can happen, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but luckily, uh, I think that there are ways of sort of mitigating this dread, and feeling kind of like, content with solitude, which to me is the kind of isolation that you choose, that, makes it not such a scary prospect ultimately. And books are, a part of that effort, I think, that, books sort of demand, uh, solitude. That's what they're designed for, and you don't feel alone when you're reading them, because you are in a way communing with another person's mind. Uh, and so, that's just one of the ingenious ways that people have come up with for dealing with that.
Mhm, mhm. I love that. And I feel like I could talk and go on and on about these things, but I do want to also have time to go into your writing craft a little bit.
Okay.
Um, First, I would like to ask, do you even have a writing routine?
I do, yeah. It's pretty rock solid now. I used to be the kind of guy who'd only be able to like produce anything only on like, pain of death. Like I've like joked before that like I wish I could just hire somebody to point a gun at me while I was writing. You know, because that kind of accountability is hard to come by. And when you're doing something like writing, where it's just like, especially early on in your career, you have no idea if anyone's gonna want to read it, if you'll ever get any better, if you can publish it, any of that stuff. It's really hard to get up that motivation. So that's, I used to be like, I'd have to take classes and then the deadlines would help me finish stuff. And these days I've gotten way more reliable about it. It's just like a simple, like 9 a.m. to noon routine,
Okay.
where I sit down, I have an internet blocker that turns on automatically, and I, do my writing. And this is, when I'm not teaching or I don't have other things I need to do, when I'm not on book tour like I am right now.
Mhm.
Um, and you know, that's usually it for the rest of the day, unless I'm on deadline, in which case I'll just like tack on a few more hours to that, and then I'll usually write at night a little bit. I do, if I'm writing at night, need to sort of stay sharp, so I do like to get hammered. And then deal with the aftermath of that in the next morning, but not during the day. I'm not that much of a slob.
So, so you don't have like a word count or any kind of goal? It's just like kind of putting in that time.
It depends on kind of what phase of the writing it is. If I'm writing a new draft, then a word count really does help. And I like to sort of reach for 1,000 words a day as like a good working pace. That's kind of realistic for me to do in 3 hours. But if it's revision, then it gets a lot harder to track that way. And it's mostly just like, I'll pick a section to work on and try to make, better as much as I can within the span of time that's allotted to me. And then if I'm on deadline, then, I just have to keep on working until the clock runs out. So that's, really does help with finishing things.
What was the process of writing the stories in the collection? Were they, I mean, I'm guessing they weren't necessarily linear. Did you, well, I guess it kind of worked because you were playing them off of each other. It's kind of like
Yeah.
a novel in a way.
Yeah. I actually do think of it as a novel. I mean, if you look at the cover, it just says fiction.
Yeah.
But I also think that, it would be unfair to just call it a novel because it does, if you don't know anything else about it, it would read a lot more like a short story collection. So I didn't want to mislead people.
Very interconnected though.
Yeah. But I think that I mean, I pretty much did write them in the order that they appear in the book.
Mhm.
But I did keep on having to return to them like multiple times. Even after I had, a full draft, I was doing full rewrites of them. Like main character, which is like the fifth story, I had to do right from scratch 4 different times because the form was just not working, right? Like first it was a Tinder conversation. And then it was like, a forum where a bunch of different people were posting, and none of those really fit the story that I was trying to work towards. So, took a lot of work. And so, it is nonlinear in that when you're revisiting stuff, you just kind of go back in whatever order and just try to make it better.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. I did want to ask also if there was anything you're working on now that that you don't mind sharing with us. You don't have to, of course. But if you don't mind.
I mean, I like answering this question actually because it gives me the opportunity to bluff and then maybe come up with something on the fly that I can use in
Okay.
my writing later. But I'm working on a novel right now that is, I think, about video games, and a bunch of other stuff too. I think maybe it could be about uh, a writing group, although, people always roll their eyes at the prospect of, writers writing writers. Um, I, have, uh, of a collection of criticism that I've been working on and off for like the last 10 years or so. And it's a sort of very weird criticism that like is kind of in a fictional wrapper. So, not like sort of straightforward essays.
Mhm.
And I don't know, that's mostly the idea around that stuff right now. I wish I could be more specific because that would mean I would have more progress on them.
No, but it's good. It's all like kind of in that generation stage. So thank you for like sharing that with us. Another thing that we like to do before anyone goes is ask them which books they would like to share. 3 books they'd like to share. And it doesn't have to be like your favorite books of all time. It doesn't have to be the most recent books. Just any 3 books that you would like to leave with the book club, things that you think we should check out.
Okay. Um, I'm miserable at doing the kind of like name 3 or name 5 things on the spot,
All right, right.
because I couldn't even tell you like the last 3 books I read probably. I keep like really detailed spreadsheets of this stuff. Uh,
Wow.
but you know, from this year, the stuff that sticks out in my mind, one is uh, uh, this book called Loved and Missed, by Susie Boyt,
Mhm.
who's actually Sigmund Freud's granddaughter and Lucian Freud's daughter. But she's this, UK writer, who's, I think, published like 9 books, but this is the first one to come out in the US. It
Mhm.
is just a fantastic novel about a mother who, or a grandmother who sort of takes custody of her granddaughter because her daughter is an addict and is not around to raise her own child. And it, is written with like such a light touch to deal with like such heavy subject matter, that it's like manages to be, like funny, as well as kind of devastating, especially towards the end. So really like that one. Another, there's this graphic novel series called Wendy, by a guy named Walter Scott, who's
Mhm.
a Canadian graphic novelist, and he just came out with the 4th installment of this series, called the Wendy Awards. They're these just incredibly funny, uh, sort of, uh, vignettes about a very messy, kind of alcoholic, art student named Wendy. And they're just like so expressive and funny. I really like them. I got to see him in New York recently when he came to give a talk. Um, and then, okay, what would the third one be? I think off the top of my head, the book DARRYL by Jackie Ess. So this is a really short novel from an indie press called, or that's about a cuckold. It's like the journal of a guy whose like lifestyle is like that, his woman goes and hooks up with other men, sometimes, in the next room over or in front of him. And it sounds like a kind of zany premise, but it is actually like, not just incredibly funny, but really like well written and clever and sort of ingeniously constructed. And it does something that I've never seen a book do before, which is, um, about partway through the book, there is a character who's introduced, who's actually a character from a different novel by a different writer, Dennis Cooper. This guy Clive, I think his name is. is from the Dennis Cooper novel, The Sluts. And uh, it nowhere in the book is that acknowledged, right? You can go to the acknowledgments page and it's not like this character is from this book by Dennis Cooper, but it's not like plagiarism. It's totally, new sort of episodes in this character's life. And I'm like, I've only ever seen that done in fan fiction before in a
Right.
completely different way for different reasons. I've never seen somebody take someone else's sort of character before and just completely appropriate it for their own book and work it into their own plot kind of seamlessly. So that in itself was fascinating, but it's also really smart and really funny.
I wonder if they like, this is not a, well, it doesn't sound like it's a, what do you call it? Open domain or free domain
I
character?
don't know what the copyright rules are
Yeah,
around like, characters. I mean, I know that you can't like, put a t-shirt with Mickey Mouse on it.
right.
That's Disney and that's an image. I don't know if there is copyright around the concept of a character.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think if someone tried to put a Harry Potter inside of their story, really, right? I think that it would be an issue, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, there was this novel recently called Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin, where J.K. Rowling is a character in it, and she dies.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, but she's an actual human being in her character.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's just interesting, interesting.
yeah.
Well, thank you for leaving us with those three. Also, thank you for your time. Thank you, first of all, for writing Rejection, which is hilarious, irreverent, and like I said, it's genius. It really is. I feel like it really when you come, you can appreciate it, everything the entire way through, but it's when it comes to its culmination that you really begin to see, excuse me, how interestingly everything's been placed together. And first you're thinking that the character that the sister that we get to meet is a genius, and then you're like, wait a minute, is Tony the genius? That's what I mean. It's like the veil upon the veil. So kudos to you for this.
Thanks. Thank you for reading it and for having
Brilliant.
your show.
Brilliant. Thank you for this, and thank you for joining us. Thank you all of you for watching the chat. If you haven't already, please make sure you pick up Rejection. Pick it up today. You're already probably watching from your phone, which means you're just a click away from picking up the book. So make sure you do that. And thank you again, Tony, for joining us.
Thanks.